closed the week lower, having started the week on the frenzy that we were just about to enter a conflict in the Ukraine. We ended it with the optimism that the Iran talks were going to deliver a breakthrough and that indeed the Ukraine crisis may not be going to explode. And yet, only 48 hours later, we do seem to be in a situation where Ukraine is already happening in some regard. It's already started. And you might argue, well, it started 7 years ago when Crimea was taken and the Donbass erupted. But nonetheless, at this moment, it would appear things are moving on the ground in the Ukraine. And according again to the United States, this is an imminent conflict. Let's kick off, as always, with our Sunday morning commentator, Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christoph, your thoughts this Sunday morning on all things geopolitics?
Good morning, John. Like everybody else, I don't think I'm a very happy person when I look around me in terms of geopolitics. So you can go from the inside out for a change and look at Ukraine first. I still find it hard to believe that this will be this kind of full-fledged invasion, including taking Kiev, which would be just an enormous amount of bloodshed and would be like a real war, something we haven't seen for a long time, and certainly not in Europe. But you are right. I mean, the Donbass is flaring up. Lugansk is flaring up. This is like a black hole because there's no Western media or outside media, for that matter, on the ground. And what we have is accounts of violations of the ceasefire. This can be anything from a shootout to a single shelling. And they skyrocketed from about 20 last week to about 6,000 apparently in the last 24 hours. So it means there's constant sniping going on and people dying, or the numbers are vastly inflated. What I find interesting is this strategy, which the US and most of its allies are having now, of making everything possible public. Every observation, every theory, every expectations, even if it's probably not a complete conviction about points of wars. And this is, of course, designed in order to control the narrative, one, and in order to prevent surprises from the other side, from the Russian side, number two. And it seems to have worked very well so far. It can't go on forever because at some point the audience will start to yawn. And I'm afraid that we're still, personally, I think we're still in this world where we will face a long, drawn-out conflict and an attempt to keep the situation cooking, rather than a full-fledged invasion, which would make the whole world united against these Russian ambitions. And that's, of course, an unpleasant scenario for everybody, because it means whatever happens next, it will not go away. And too many of us are still looking at this as a situation which will resolve itself either way, there will be an invasion or not. Look at it in terms of an end game. And I'm skeptical we're going to see this, even with an invasion, a partial invasion, the situation will keep cooking, and that's very, very unpleasant. And we can discuss this later, we should come back to it. That has repercussions all the way into the Iranian negotiations, all the way into US-China negotiations, all the way in China's own strategy in the region and globally. So it's not a small regional thing which has to be settled between the US and Russia. It's not Russia trying to gain some attention and the US giving it a little attention, then it's over. We should discuss these repercussions, because so far, most of us didn't have the time and effort to spend on what this really means. But let's stop there.
Let's welcome Dr. Aldo Flores Quiroga back to the table. Of course, the former Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons at Mexico's Ministry of Energy, back in Mexico, but today sitting in Riyadh. First, Dr. Aldo, I would love to get a review of the meeting you went to Riyadh for, the International Energy Forum. Of course, it brought together many of the world's leaders in and around the energy space, most notably, of course, the Saudi energy minister. I did enjoy your post on LinkedIn, the top 10 takeaways. How much was this meeting indeed overshadowed by Ukraine, or was it at all?
Ukraine was not at the top of the conversation, which it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. Recall that this is a meeting of outlooks in which the IEA, the IF, and OPEC jointly organized this conversation among them and with experts and leaders of the energy industry around the world. And it was a meeting to which, by the way, other heads of international organizations, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, like the IRENA, even regional organizations like OLARE from Latin America were present. You had prominent businessmen. There were many different and high-level experts participating. And the takeaways that I mentioned, by the way, they weren't a consensus view of any kind. I was trying to reflect what I felt was the most common perspective of the various presentations that I listened to. And overall, there's this view that whatever happens with, I'll say, with geopolitics and with other trends, we're in a situation of great uncertainty. There's a political transition, an economic transition, and an energy transition going on. And these three transitions are generating very mixed signals for energy investors. And the result is that we're having an underinvestment especially in the oil and gas industry, that does not help in the process of transition itself to a cleaner energy system. So that was a very important concern. Obviously, events like what might happen in Ukraine do not, they help in terms of sending price signals for investors, but obviously they generate instability.
One of the things
a lot, if I may,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add one bit on the geopolitics.
Yeah.
I'm in the not so optimistic camp, in the sense that I believe that since this is a political transition we're going through, it's also a geopolitical transition. And I think that it will get more difficult before we find a new equilibrium in international affairs and economic affairs.
I just wanted to follow up quickly, Dr. Aldo, on the report that was released in Riyadh this week as part of this gathering by the IEF and the Resources for the Future. It's posted on our daily digest today. It's obviously 50 long pages, so read it when you have some time. But ultimately, what I took away from that on the headline, Aldo, was that there's a huge disparity between the projected demand forecasts for oil going forward from the different participants. Your thoughts on that, and how did that get tackled at the gathering?
Well, it was mentioned right away. What you have is a disparity of 105 million barrels per day, which is bigger than the size of today's oil market. So the disparities from the highest, the scenario of highest demand and the scenario of lowest demand. And of course, this also means that there's a disparity between desires and reality, because the lowest demand scenarios are really assuming that everything is done right by all the key actors in order to reduce fossil fuel consumption. And it's not necessarily what we're witnessing. The politics of the transition are very difficult.
This is 2050 demand, or just to understand?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And I was reviewing the energy outlooks of 20 years ago, and the concerns are the same, and it's surprising in a way that these messages are the same. The need, it's basically the same conversation. It hasn't changed a lot. Perhaps the difference is that we're seeing more aggressive scenarios for the downside of demand, downside in terms of the transition.
Let's, if I just, Irene, I don't know if you have that quote that I picked up earlier. I wanted to just to show it and read it before getting Christoph's comment from the Estonia Prime Minister over the weekend in the FT weekend, which it touches on this political transition as well as the current crisis. There seems to be a certain type of naivety towards Russia said the Estonia Prime Minister in an interview with the FT. I was trying to explain this to President Macron. You're seeing this through the prism of a democratic country. You say that it's going to be super expensive for Russia to have a war, but Putin doesn't care. He's not up for re-election. He's not up for elections. This concept that economics, that normality, that there is some sort of weight of that on decision making in Russia, or indeed in any space where the big geopolitical changes are happening, Christoph. What's your thoughts on this comment? Is the Estonian Prime Minister right that there is a naivety in the European Western leadership towards Russia?
Yes, I think in this particular quote, she is right towards Russia. She's also right in a more general sense. Autocrats have means about which democratic politicians hopefully don't dream, but they don't have them. And I would go one step further. There's also an underestimation of what sanctions can produce in terms of resistance in the affected countries. So we know what the Russian elite is trying to do is two things at least. One is to prevent their own population from taking to the streets and from being protesting, as in Kazakhstan, as in Belarus, as in Azerbaijan, as in Armenia before, and in the Ukraine. By showing them that it leads nowhere. And we know that on the other hand, they have this mixture of nationalism and insecurity, wanting a new security architecture, NATO not hemming them in somewhere. Now, if you produce sanctions against a country, chances are that the domestic propaganda starts to become much more effective. So these talks about the rest of the world is against us, and so they always seem to galvanize some resistance in those countries on which sanctions are imposed. And in Russia, we see this very strongly. And I think Russia has a long history of, they always say our people are patient, of people suffering and still the system not collapsing, not rising. What we had already is that the relatively high growth, economic growth of Russia until the occupation of the Crimea got disrupted. Not so much by sanctions, also by sanctions, but also by these very tight economic policies which were done in order to protect against future sanctions, weaning the country of dollar credits, accumulating dollar and gold reserves, trying to have a domestic system which is as least dependent and a government system on foreign credit relations as possible. All of that is like a massive tightening of fiscal policies, and that brought growth rates from an average of 5% to somewhere below 1%, while the rest of the world shouldered on. And still, it did not result in the kind of protests which you would expect in a democracy. So also in that sense, she's very right.
Aldo, how does this all look from Mexico and South America? Obviously, the crisis in Ukraine, this geopolitical restructuring transition, we've seen it in South America, I suppose, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, the recent elections in Chile. There's been obviously the Mexican position. What does this look like? A, the immediate crisis of Ukraine from South America's perspective, and B, this sort of geopolitical transition globally. Where does South America stand?
Well, let me invert the terms of the question, because Latin America is undergoing its own transition. And there's by the end of this year, what we will see is that most of the countries, certainly the large countries of the region and the energy producers of the region, will have shifted toward the left of the political spectrum yet again. This shift is not purely ideological. There's a component of dissatisfaction among the voters with whatever the governments were doing during the economic downturn and certainly the pandemic. So you see Chile with a president of the left and central left. In Brazil, most likely Lula is coming back. In Colombia, a candidate that is also on the left is most likely to win. Peru is already a leftist president. Mexico has such a leftist president, Argentina as well. So there is a shift toward the left, and that means also a shift in energy policies, but it's not uniform. For example, in Colombia, the candidate on the left is promoting the energy transition. And while he will not necessarily work against the current projects of Colombia's state-owned company, Ecopetrol, it is nonetheless the case that he that he sees that its role should change and should focus on clean energies. He has said things like, we must replace the politics of death, which is what he associates with fossil fuels, with the politics of life that he associates with sustainable energies. At the same time, you see, like in cases like in Brazil, where the ex-president Lula, now candidate Lula, is calling for a revision of the terms of the relationship between Petrobras and private investors. In other countries, everyone's talking about oil and gas subsidies, gasoline subsidies again, because of these high prices.
Does this transition in South America lean in favor of the rise of China? China is increasingly, like Africa, we've seen it before, getting a lot of footholds into South America. Does this transition in South America, Latin America, play in favor of China?
Well, I don't know if the ideological parties, we have yet to see it in terms of, let's call it state capitalism. There are countries that are going in that direction. But what is true is that there's an approach that we've seen in the past few months among Latin American countries, or between them and China. You had the president of Argentina, the president of Brazil going to China. You have China approaching for proposing projects. So there is also this type of realignment going on in the region. Of course, no one likes the prospect of war in Europe or anything like that. But this is part of this broader shift in trends in geopolitical processes and alignments.
Christoph, last week, of course, the big news of the geopolitics drove a lot of things, but also the idea of the market being quite tight is still underpinning the sort of fundamental foundations of this market. And we saw in the US data on driving data and inventories and other such indicators. They are all tight. You mentioned earlier Iran's talks may be impacted by this, because the Iran piece was giving some relief to the market that new supply might come. How do you see the ramifications perhaps from the crisis in the Ukraine derailing or impacting Iran talks and perhaps then the return of Iranian oil?
On the Iran question specifically, there is the normal aspect of thinking that the US and its allies will try to make sure that oil supplies are available if Russia stops to some extent exporting, perhaps. But there's a more specific story also, which has to do with former Soviet Union countries on the fringes, and in particular with Azerbaijan and Armenia. And you know that they had a long-standing regional conflict there, and Armenia is a sizable oil producer. Azerbaijan, of course, is a sizable oil producer. What happens there is that Armenia has been more or less lined up with Russia, had this domestic protests and all of that, clamped down on them, had a new president. And then suddenly a war broke out between the two, which was more or less won by Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan is very close to Iran, language-wise, culturally, and also politically. So if the US wants to encourage continued flow of oil from not only Russia, but in particular those neighboring regions like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and all that, then it's natural this will foster it or reach a deal with Iran, because these countries are closely connected, and that would secure it would make sense for them to secure oil supplies to bring that Iran also to the table there. That's something which Azerbaijan also would like to see and to support. So you can already see the bits and pieces falling into a new shapes in order to safeguard themselves from whatever may happen between Russia and the Ukraine. And that is one example where I think the confrontation with Russia will have an impact on Americans and Europe's willingness to engage with a deal with Iran, keeping Azerbaijan and other oil producers on board. If you go east and you have a country like Kazakhstan, which has to navigate between China and Russia, there's probably other things which may fall in different directions. What you have in this whole region between Europe and Central Asia is different from Latin America in the sense that in Latin America, you have fragmentation, you have elections, which you have electoral cycles which turn back and forth, sometimes, as Aldo described, the same direction across countries, sometimes not. And that's a constant reordering process driven to some extent by elections. What you have in Central Asia and Europe is now a reordering of the pieces in a much bigger, there the term is justified, geopolitical puzzle played by the US, by China, by Europe, and by the regional players, even if they don't like the name, Russia and Ukraine and others. And this is going to be a reordering and then probably, likely frozen for another, who knows, 10, 20 years until something else happens.
Let's get the survey question in again, give everybody a chance to sort of cast a view forward. Slightly broad question, but nonetheless, it seemed to be the tug of war we were witnessing last week. What will it play out this week? Who will win the geopolitical oil price battle this week? Ukraine crisis moves oil to $100, or Iran breakthrough moves to the bearish side to $90. If indeed we believe what Boris Johnson is telling us this morning on the BBC, that Russia is planning the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, these are major statements that, you know, it's beyond crying wolf at this stage with the language that is being used. Meanwhile, Dr. Aldo, a lot of the sort of tightness relief that is expected to come, or has been, putting aside all the drama of geopolitics, that new supply coming into the market, yes, Iran, if indeed a deal is done, but also very much in the Americas, Guyana, the shale production, offshore Brazil. What's your outlook for new supply coming from the non-OPEC plus universe out of the Americas in this year and outlook to 23, perhaps?
Well, certainly it's about the countries you mentioned, mostly it's Brazil. Guyana and Suriname will take a little bit longer, but Brazil is set to keep increasing its production all the way to 2030. You see various estimates, they can go up to 5 million barrels per day, 4 million barrels per day, depends who you're talking with. But certainly it's a Brazil story. On natural gas, it's an Argentina story with unconventionals. Then again, it still requires infrastructure build-up pipelines in order to bring more of this gas to the market. And it's mainly about that. Venezuela has brought back production, but it's still a question how it will be evolving, mostly owing to the politics and to the underinvestment and mismanagement that the effect of that will reverberate for many years. Mexico is in a declining production path, stabilized now, but it does not look like it will be increasing soon.
Do you expect more nationalization in Mexico? I believe there is a bill in the Mexican parliament that could reinforce the sort of nationalization track for?
Well, there is a bill for the power sector, and it is in the direction that you just mentioned. For the oil and gas sector, there's no shift in legislation per se, but there is a shift in focus in terms of policy. So the tendering process to bring more private sector investment has stopped. There's a reversal in the opening of the fuels markets. So it is very much right now either the beginning of a long pause or a temporary pause, depending on how the political process evolves. But Ecuador, for example, is opening a bit. It is returning to production sharing contracts, allowing more private sector investment. Colombia,
and of course, shale looks like the Permian looks like it is finally reaching back to levels seen before COVID.
Yeah, but speaking of your question about what was the mood in Riyadh in the symposium, nobody that I recall was ever said during the discussions that we should expect a big jump in production from the Permian. They didn't say it will not increase. They were saying that the business proposition from the Permian is not the same as it was 10 years ago. Now there remains a concern among investors about recuperating their investments, getting some of the profits, and that may affect the pace of production increase in such a way that it will not be the same as what we saw 10 years ago, which is not to say that it will not increase.
Yeah, it certainly seems like certainly rig counts are jumping again. Let's just get the survey result and give Christoph the last word here this morning. So sort of 65% Ukraine crisis to 100 tips Iran breakthrough. Clearly that is the sort of the big watch for the market open. We also have this week, Christoph, the Fed chairman sitting in front of the Senate, the US Congress, giving an update on where they're going with their rates policy. That's sort of lingering on the sidelines at the moment, but ultimately there's a lot of noise around the place that the tightening cycle may accelerate from 25 basis points to 50. So some of the things coming up this week, anything else, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think in terms of, we have to be very careful. What happens in the Ukraine now does not mean that all the energy questions and answers have been changing. And so more likely, this will just stabilize at current levels. And in detail, what this means is that in terms of your question, for example, even an Iran deal is not necessarily associated with bringing oil prices down, because most forecasters have already placed that in their forecast. Powell will not change his statements because of Ukraine very much, presumably will just emphasize we remain data-driven and keep all options open. Stepping back, the important statement is that not everything changes because of the war or the lingering conflict in the Ukraine. And that means that we're still in a world where we have supply growth. And I would agree with you that this, what we're seeing in the Shell Basin, becomes more explosive. The carrot of high prices is large enough at 90 for investors to say, okay, let's cash in on it. You know, this is a market where they can hedge for a year, so they don't need to be afraid of their profits if they lock in current prices. And that we are seeing happening from the shale side. The demand side, what you mentioned early on, these huge discrepancies, that is just because we have moved away from forecasts to scenarios. So scenarios, everybody can say anything, but if you look for forecasts, there's still a discrepancy, but it is between people who expect high and lower economic growth. And I think day by day, the evidence is that global economic growth is not accelerating, it's decelerating. And that means in oil market terms, we are still in a situation where sometimes between spring and summer, the balances will tilt, where supply will exceed demand, where these very low inventories will stabilize and probably start adjusting upwards a little bit. That's still the two views on oil markets. And the jury, of course, is out, and it's maybe a 50-50 situation. But I would not say that because of the Ukraine, we're now seeing higher prices for much longer. We may see the usual spike associated with these kinds of uncertainties, but come the summer, we are in an oil market which will remain, and that's the key point here, which should not be forgotten, which will remain under the control of the few OPEC countries which have the spare capacity. They can moderate it any day they want. They can tighten it any day they want. They are the key players here. As their objectives are fairly consistent and fairly easy to see. And so we should expect this gradual nudging up until something bad happens, or until they, for political reasons, decide to give some leeway.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. Big week ahead. Oil prices trading still well above the 93 mark on Brent. We have our own Fujairah workshop, I see, being posted on the podcast at the moment. We also have two other major events this week, which will allow and create platforms for a lot of talk on energy and oil meeting the headlines. We have where Dr. Aldo is in Riyadh. The IPTC starts, I think, today or tomorrow, which is a big event in Riyadh. And we also have IP Week, now called IE Week, in London, of course, kicking off on Monday, Tuesday. So there'll be lots of opportunities, at least, for major energy leaders to comment on the stresses that might be coming into the system as the Ukraine story unfolds in real time every day. We also have another big moment this week, which I think is worth noting, and that is in the UK, where there will be announced that you don't have to stay at home anymore if you're positive for COVID. Never mind if you're in the chain of COVID or if you're a close contact, positive COVID cases no longer required to quarantine in the UK. That's to be announced this week. That's a big step into the unknown on some level, at least from where we've come from over the last 2 years, which in itself is a big potential demand boost across if that was to be followed in other places. Thank you so much, Dr. Aldo. Great to have you. Great to see you. Christoph as well, back in London. Thank you so much for getting up early, given that time change. All the best. Every morning, 10:30 UAE time, we'll be here to reflect on the market dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you.